Morning. Today I'm going to do a JWT being validated by a big IP. And I'm going to try to go through this pretty quick just because there's quite a bit of content to it. And it's a little bit difficult to programmatically do this. So I'll show you where I kept my notes, which I'll put somewhere in comments, and then also where I've kept the exported policy. This came through as a customer request this last week where somebody was looking to do a JWT validation without having to use maybe the API protection because they didn't want all the features in it, or just trying to find a way to validate without having to look through all the docs and pieces, because it is kind of pieces and parts of the OIDC flow and the OAuth flow. So we're going to start out. I'm going to show you where the configuration lives. So moving into code, because I'm going to show you it on how I build out all the pieces first. When I build out the JWT, I'm doing it as an octet type. And they're both asymmetric, whether you're using octet or the RSA types. Octet just is pretty easy for me to show off, but the workflow would be very similar for the other kinds. So the first part is you have to encode a key, right, or a passphrase. So in this case, I'm going to create my JWT. I'm going to run this command right here, and you can kind of see all the steps. So I'm going to encode my last name, and you could really use anything. Just keep in mind that's the mechanism in which we're going to use the passphrase. So it spits out this key right here, and you can see that's exactly the same. Next, I have to create the header. So the JWT is comprised of 3 components, right? And this is one of them. So I need the header, I need the payload, and then I need the signature wrapping on it. So when I'm looking through here, I'm going to create the header, and in my case, I'm going to use HS256 as the algorithm, right? The type is octet, the kind, right? Or the key ID, sorry, is 0001. Again, these could be other things, except for the octet needs to be this way, right? Because you got to define the type. But the key ID helps it find, big IP, helps it find the correct key in order to do the asymmetric decryption. So in this case, if I go and I go ahead and do this, right, the same kind of thing spits out. We'll do this down here. It spits out that EWOG, so EWOG. So this is the second part of my JWT. And then I've got to get into the payload, and the payload is what is actually important for the backend application. So in this case, I've got like a subscriber number piece I'm using, my name, admin true. I'm just throwing some extra claims in here just to, I don't know, fill it out. The issuer, and then this expiry time. And the expiry time is the epoch time. So you'll want something that expires in less than 2 hours. So in this case, I'm going to spit this out. And it's already here, but we'll do this one more time. Now I've got all 3 pieces, right? So I've got the first piece, which is the signature. I guess I have 4 pieces. The signature, then I've got the header, right? Then I've got the payload, and you can see these all starting to get stacked together. And then what I'm gonna do here is using that name, right? So using that key that I had up here, I'm going to then base64 encode it with openssl. And that will spit me out the last part. And when it spits out the last part, that means it's taken both parts of it and it's going to spit out the third. And then that third part becomes the end. So this is the first part. You saw that up here, right? This is the second part, and you can see that right here. I take the first and the second, I spit out the third, and now this is my actual JWT. So if I wanted to use this, right, I would send this as the authorization bearer header towards Access Policy Manager. And then Access Policy Manager would do the key against it to make sure that it's valid, and then it's going to also look for things like the subscriber, the key ID, pieces of the header, right, and some of the pieces of the payload as well. So I've created all the JWT, and you can see that here. You can use this with this isn't anything to do with Big IP, but creating a JWT, you could use it in Nginx, you could use it in Big IP, you can use it in Distributed Cloud for the CDN authorization. It works exactly the same way. But this customer was asking for Big IP. Once I have this part made, then I need to go create the Big IP objects. And for that, we're going to jump into the Big IP. So inside the Big IP, here we go. I've got to create a few different objects. To totality, it's like 7. So it's a little bit, oh no, I didn't share. I did share. It's a little bit to the how many parts not great, but does allow you to build out the pieces that you need. So I'm gonna go ahead and log back in. Looks like I've been off for a little bit. Okay, and then inside here, the first part I need is under access. Actually, it's all under access. Federation JSON web token. And then under the token, I'm gonna work my way down. So I need the key configuration. And you can see mine in here. There's that 0001, the HS256, the octet type, right? Also, I'm using the base 64 encoded piece, and my shared secret is the encoded, right, Calalang. So that gets me my key configuration. Then I've got to get into my token configuration, and the token configuration, to me, you kind of equate it to like looking up in a SAN cert or like in a certificate where you want to match resource types, and that gives you a validation, right? So in my case, I had that issuer of my last name. Access token expires in a certain period of time. In this case, I was using HS256, and then I'm going to attach that key that I just made into here. So now I've got the key and the token, and then I'm gonna go work on the provider. So the provider itself, in this case, is going to be utilizing the RS, so the JWT RS provider. And you'll see that in a second. I'm gonna go create the OAuth provider. So now I've got three things. Then I'm gonna go into the OAuth resource server provider, and I'm gonna create my JWT RS provider. And what this says, here's where things start to nest together. The provider is going to use the token configuration. The token configuration has the key configuration, right? And this provider goes into the JWT provider. So that way they all link together. So now I've got 4 objects that are linking together. At this point, I can make an access policy. So I've got an access policy, right? And I'm gonna go and look at my policies, and I created one called JWT per session policy, right? And in here, when you're looking at it, I've created one brick, and that brick has the OAuth scope in it. And all it says is that the token validation mode is internal, because it's to me, right? And then this is that JWT provider in the OAuth scope. So access policy looks to see the JWT provider list, which then points at the OAuth provider, which then points at the token, which then points at the key. So now I've got it all linked together, right? And if I go back to my big IP, then I would attach this profile, right, to my virtual server. So I've got a virtual server up for bigip.calalang.net. So let's jump over here to bigip.calalang.net, and I look at this one. And then down towards the bottom where access shows up, I'm gonna have that JWT per session profile linked onto the bit. Now, if I tried to browse to that, because JWTs are typically meant for programmatic, right? It would be really difficult. You'd be more in like the OIDC flow if you were a human. This would be programmatic like an API endpoint. Now, if I try to browse to it, it says the page isn't working because it's trying to authenticate that bearer header. If I do this inside a command line, which I'm going to jump into now, we can actually see what these types of things look like. So let's jump over to VS Code. So now back in VS Code, down here at the bottom, and again, I'll put all of these things in the actual comment section. Down here at the bottom, I'm gonna do one request without the header that I created, right? That bearer header right here. And that first request looks like this. Actually, let's clear this out so we can actually see that all together. So that first request looks like this. Invalid request. Comes back as a 400. The bearer is invalid. It won't let me talk to it. Which is right, because Big IP is stopping me because access is actually stopping it. So the second one, I actually took that jot. So here's the first part, here's the second part. You can see them kind of highlighting. And here's that third part that's highlighted at the bottom. And in this case, it's the same exact thing, but I'm adding the header in place. And when I add the header in place, let's clear this out again. All right, I add the header in place and I go at it. Right now, the header is actually valid. What you're seeing here is my Nginx website. So in here, I've got that curl request. It comes back as a 200, right? Everything is valid through that, and you actually get to see the resource. So in this case, I'm turning on JWT validation and it's going through Access Policy Manager just as the JWT validator. So you really would have something issuing that JWT, right, to the client, in this case like an API client, that's going to try to go consume that resource through the big IP. It seems like a pretty simple configuration. It does take 6 or 7 different object types, but it does make it a reusable object, right? Now I have this JWT validation engine, and I could use it across many different VIPs. And those VIPs could be API endpoints that now I have some protection in front of it against. So it's a really easy thing where I'm not implementing full OIDC workflows, but it allows me to do JWT validation. Now, when I went and did this in code, that's not really an option for APM. So you saw me create up in here, create all the pieces of the JWT, and then the pieces I had to work through. What you can do in Access is export a policy. So what I've done is I've exported the policy so somebody can come through and grab the policy if they'd like and see all the objects that it creates, right? And in here, it's going to be under Big IP, and I'm using Ansible to put my policy in place. So I created the policy, I exported it, I stored it as code, right? And now I can reuse that policy across my different Big IPs by using something like Ansible. So I'm using the Ansible one, and then I've got a particular role for installing access profiles. So this access profile, the one we're working on right now, is the, let's go up to the top, is the import OIDC APM profile, and that's looking for profile common, not OIDC, we want the JWT one. Import policy JWT, here we go. We are gonna look for the file JWT per session policy conf under the files location. So if you'd like to go get this profile, it's living right here, you could then break it apart inside your Big IP and see all the 6 objects that I created. Of course, it won't be attached to your virtual server. The timing will also expire for the epoch time, so you'll need to adjust that. But at least you'll have all the objects together. And you can see how I'm actually building out the Ansible playbook. So in this case, it's just wait to make sure that it's there, and then import whenever the state equals present. So I'm gonna jump back over to me. In this case, the demo was slightly different, not entirely in code, but that's because I do have to show you some pieces working. Hopefully you got to the end of this and now you know all the steps that it's gonna take. It's not a very long process. It is 6 or 7 objects, but it makes it a reusable object, and then you can also programmatically put that back into a Big IP or many Big IPs because they're all going to use the same kind of JWT validation. So for things like API endpoints, this is an amazing tool that you can use for, let's say, authorizing, right? An API endpoint to be able to come talk to you. There are things that you can do with inside the JWT and that payload to validate user and transition to different authentication methods. However, most people don't actually need that. So as always, I wish everybody good luck. If you have any questions on the solution, go ahead and open an issue and let me know. Have a great week.